Abigail or anyone else that's on early. I have a box that I can use to see questions you've asked, and I get it by clicking the Q&A button down at the bottom, but I'm not sure exactly what you see. Can one of you find that?
Abigail or anyone else that's on early.
All right. I saw that. So Bob, and I see the Q&A box that worked. It looks like I can answer with text or live. Great. Okay, well, that's cool. We are live streaming on YouTube as well, but you won't be able to ask questions that way. Hi there. Okay, well, I think we're in good shape. So do any of the 5 of you have any questions that you want to talk about before we start? Oh, I actually I have a question for you. How did you know the link to join? Did you get it? Did you get an email after you signed up? Okay. And then you asked, is this a 3-day class? And I'm not exactly sure what you mean. This is the 6th day of class, and we have 2 more nights after this. Okay, good, Abigail. I just wanted to make sure everybody got the link. I was worried that, I needed to send out a link and I hadn't done that. So anyway, yeah, we've got 2 days left, tomorrow and Thursday. Thursday will be the last day. And then next week we'll start all over again on Monday. So, if you're interested in doing the course again, and there will be some tweaks. I've already tweaked some things in the curriculum based on what I've learned here by doing this, or, so if you want to do it again, you're welcome to. If you have a friend that might be interested, you can tell them to join. Yes. No, this week is 4 days. I'm doing the class all 4 days this week. I had somebody fill in on Thursday. That was Johnny, but I'll be doing it all the rest of this week. Yeah, Abigail's right. Next week will be the start of another repeat of this class. It is 2 weeks long, and so yeah, it'll be basically the same content. I'm not changing any of the content. I've just rearranged a few things. There were some days that I thought were a little bit fast, and some days that I thought were a little bit slow, and so just small rearrangements here and there. No major changes. Oh yes, I am on mute. I said I'll smile. I'm happy. I'm happy to be here with all of you. Hoping this Zoom thing works well. Excited to teach another night, but also just sitting here trying to make sure I've got everything in order and ready to go. So you should. Well, another thing with Zoom, I think, is you can see me even while I'm sharing my screen, which is maybe kind of cool. Except that I don't know how to see the chat window when I'm sharing my screen. Hmm. It's not so great. I appreciate that advice, but I can't figure out where to click. Ah, there we go. Up here, maybe. Ah, cool. Okay. Thank you for that. I found it. Perfect. Okay.
Hey guys, we are on lesson 6 of Lambda School's mini bootcamp. We are using Zoom webinars for the very first time. So I'm hoping that everything is working out all right. Can I get some feedback from the crowd about if you guys can see and hear me, just to make sure that we're good to go before we do anything? Okay, At least one person can see and hear me. That seems like a really good start. Let's start with the lesson then. All right, so welcome to night 6. Are we on night 6? Yes, we are on night 6 of Web Dev 101, which is Lambda School's mini course in web development. So tonight we are going to be talking all about data structures. So we're going to be talking about these two built-in data structures in JavaScript called arrays and objects. And these will allow us to group like bits of data together in a meaningful way. So I'm excited to get into that. I'm Deandra Ryan Moss. I'm the instructor for this mini bootcamp, and I am teaching you guys live on Zoom from Bisbee, Arizona. And this class will be on YouTube later if you guys want to view it. So it will still be available on YouTube. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Lambda School before we jump into the lesson for tonight. So Lambda School is a 6-month course for web development and computer science. So it is a full-time immersive. It is all online. It is a combination of live lectures, Q&As, group work, homework, personal projects. We set up a curriculum designed to get you from the point where you're just beginning to learn about web development and computer programming, and at the end, you're ready and able to create web apps, web content, front-end development, back-end development, and get hired into that job that you're looking for. So one question I get a lot is, what kind of job can you expect coming out of Lambda School? Is it comparable to what you would expect coming out of a 4-year degree? How much are you going to make? What kind of things are you going to do? And of course, that's going to be really different from student to student, but I can give you a general idea of what to expect. For starters, what we teach in Lambda School is specifically oriented towards web development. So the job that you're going to be the most qualified for is going to be developing web content. That means web apps, websites. However, computer science and web development is a little loose. So for example, I've known people who have gone through a web dev immersive and ended up in a mobile development job. I personally went through a web development immersive and ended up doing mostly data aggregation work and was kind of starting to transition into some machine learning stuff before I switched over to teaching. So even though web development is going to be your main point of entry, there's lots of opportunity to jump from different fields inside of programming. So that's definitely something that you could potentially expect from your career. As far as comparing this to a 4-year degree, I will just say from my own experience that in my company, I was a big part of the hiring process when we were bringing on new people. And our experience was that the people coming out of 4-year degrees seemed a lot less qualified than the people coming out of immersives. So every company is going to be different, and some companies might value that diploma a little more than others. But for us, just looking at your straight up skills, I actually really think that an immersive is going to teach you what you really need to know on the job way better than a CS degree. So it's a personal choice for everyone, but just a little bit of insight on that. Finally, as far as pay goes, Lambda's deferred tuition model is that you don't have to start paying your tuition back until you're at a job making 50K or over. So that kind of lets you know that our expectation is that you'll be making at least 50K. However, in my experience, 50K is pretty low for a development job. So I've seen people starting anywhere from 60 up to 100K. Once again, I can't put a hard number down for you, and it's going to depend on your background experience, how well you interview, how lucky you are, and all that. But you can expect to be getting a pretty solid paying job once you get out of this. It's a financially sound industry to be getting into, to say the least. So there's a little bit of insight for you guys on what you can expect once you're done with the full-time course. As always, if you're interested in getting started on applying to the official Lambda School course, reach out to Karen Zachary and she can get you started on that process. As for us, enough talk, let's get to some programming. So I am going to share my screen for you guys and we will dive into doing some arrays and objects in Replit. So let me go ahead and do that. All right. Cool. So, the editor is loading. Give it a second. Let me try refreshing Replit. Okay. Uh-oh. There we go. We have Replit up and running. Let's go ahead and jump into doing some coding. Okay, so arrays and objects. These things are called data structures, and there are a lot of different data structures within computer science. Most are not going to be actually built into the language. A lot of these things are just, they're not language specific. They're just kind of these ideas that abstractly exist and we could apply across individual languages to sort our data out. That's something we'll be diving into a lot more in the main curriculum. But what we're going to look at tonight is just two specific data structures called arrays and objects. And these are both actually built into JavaScript. So they are designed for us to do cool, useful things. So let me start out by doing a little what not to do example. So we can see a scenario where we might want to use an array. So here's for arrays. Let's start out with what not to do. Okay. So let's say that we have, I'm trying to create some variables for all the cars I've owned. So I might start off with car 1. My first car was a Toyota Privia, a pretty rad van. My second car was a Florida Econoline, also an even more rad van, except it was from the 80s, so it didn't run super well. After that, I had a Jetta, et cetera, et cetera. So I've had 2 more cars since then. And finally, let's do my 5th car, which is my current car, a Frontier. Okay. So here is a nice little JavaScript rendering of all the cars that I have owned. And you might have noticed that, sorry. 1 second, guys, trying to get, Zoom is blinking at me and I want to make sure that nothing important is happening that I'm not seeing. Sorry, this might be a little bit of a choppy class as we get used to the new system. Oh, here's a chat window just popping up. Okay, cool. So I see, and I do see one person mentioning having trouble with the audio. So I've heard that most people can hear me, but if anyone else is having issues, just speak up so we can troubleshoot it if we're struggling. All right, sorry for the interruption. Want to make sure that I'm not just talking to myself here. Let's go back to this array example. Okay, at least some people are having audio, are good on audio, so I'll just type into the chat real quick that if you can't hear, check your settings. Okay, sorry about that again. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to this, this car example. So right here, I've created 5 JavaScript objects, 5 JavaScript variables to represent my cars. And really, I probably should have started at 0 so we can get some practice with 0 indexing, which we will talk a lot about tonight. So here is a list of all the cars I've owned. And there should be kind of a red flag going off when I was writing this code, because I was violating my #1 principle of writing code, which is to write dry code, which means don't repeat yourself. Okay, so this idea of don't repeat yourself, it basically means that whenever you're doing something really repetitive, that's a sign that you probably should be doing something a little different. So for example, when we did our loop example, we wrote a console log 6 different times. And when we see something like that, it generally means that, that there is a better way to do it. So for example, here I've written out almost the same line of code with a few changes 5 times in a row. That means that I'm not writing dry code and there's a better way to do it. So not only was this maybe a little more time consuming, but it's also, But there's also something kind of structurally wrong with this from a coding perspective. And that's the fact that there's no way to link these things. So all 5 of these variables refer to a related piece of information. But from the code's perspective, they're just totally separate variables. So we as human beings, this is one of those thinking like a software engineer examples, because we as human beings can clearly see that the variable names follow a pattern. So we as human beings might surmise that these are related in some way, but the code doesn't care. From JavaScript's perspective, these are just totally separate. And we don't want that. If we're creating variables that are related in some way, that means that we want to find a way within the code to actually relate them together. And this is an example where we would want to use something called an array. So I'm going to create an array called cars that's going to contain all this information in a way better, drier way. So I'll go ahead and throw all my cars back in here. Okay. So let's check out the difference between this array versus this what not to do example. So for starters, we can see that it's just less code. I didn't have to type quite so many things to create this. That's already a good sign, but it's not the most powerful thing about this cars array. So what's more important is that I actually only created one variable here. So I just created one variable that contains multiple bits of data, multiple strings in here. So in that way, all these things exist in one place. When I look up the cars variable, instead of finding one, I actually find all of them together. So we really like having all these things in one place, because from the code's perspective, these are actually structured in a way where we know that they are related. The other thing that's now built into the code is the order. So I mentioned at the beginning that these were the cars I mentioned these are the cars I've had in the order that I've had them. And the order was, from a human perspective, we could see it based on the numbers, but now the order is actually built into the data structure that we put in. And we'll see in just a minute why that's super useful. So we really like this. It's a sleeker way to write it, and now we've actually grouped our cars together in a meaningful way. So let me break down the syntax of creating an array. Well, we start off with our constant keyword as usual, followed by the name of our array. Notice that I've used a plural word to name my array. This is a pretty standard convention. When we create arrays, we want to give the variable name, we want to make the variable name plural. And that is just a way of cueing to our fellow developers that we're dealing with an array. So that's just something that we do by convention. It's pretty useful. Then we use our single equal sign as usual for assignment. Now for something a little different. Just like we use quotes or other things, so just like we use quotes, for example, to indicate that we're working with a string, we use these hard brackets to indicate that we're working with an array. And this actually ties into a question I just saw pop up, which I'll answer right now, which is that the brackets also appear in Replit as a way of Replit letting us know, hey, this is an array. Just like Replit displays the quotes to tell us that the thing is a string, it displays the brackets to let us know we're working with an array. So these two opening and closing brackets signify to the computer that we are about to write an array. And then following that, we put everything we want to place inside of an array in order, separated by commas. So we don't necessarily have to put it on a new line. We could do an array where we have some numbers in here. And notice that I've just put this on one line. For me personally, if it fits on one line, I usually put it on one line. If it doesn't, I'll do this style where I put every entry. That's just a readability issue. You know, if you're on a team, someday they'll probably have requirements about how they want you to format your arrays. But for right now, you can do either style just based on readability. So, all right. So yeah, white space, once again, is in JavaScript, new lines and white space and tabs are completely based on readability. They don't actually interfere with the code running. They just interfere with our ability as developers to read and edit our code. So each entry inside the array is going to be placed inside, separated by commas. And we do want to put them in order if the data has meaningful order. So arrays are really great for lists of like items, and those lists can be ordered. They don't need to be. For example, if we had, you know, a list of, let's say, students in the class, we might have, I'm going to pick on everyone who's asked a question so far. So we might have Catherine, and then we might have Ari, followed by Dan, etc. So there's no real order to the students in the class. Maybe I could rank them by my favorite to least favorite. Just kidding. But but it's totally fine to put unordered data in an array, but it's really useful for ordered data, which I will show you in just a minute. So when I access this cars variable, it gives me the entire list. The cars variable refers to the whole list of cars. But sometimes I might want to access individual items. And for that, we need indexing. So I'm going to, in the comments over here, denote the indexing of all of these items. Okay, so we would think of the, and this is, to be fair, this is a little confusing. This is one of probably new programmers' least favorite thing to learn because it's so easy to mix up at the beginning. So we start counting at 0. So the first entry in this list is going to be the entry at index 0. The second entry is at index 1, et cetera, et cetera. So that is something that, not to curse you guys, but I promise you, you will make this mistake at least several times, maybe several hundred times. And then all of a sudden it'll just click and it'll be second nature and you'll be counting starting at 0 in your sleep. Okay, so what happens if we want to look at one specific item in our array? Well, for that, we would use the lookup. So we can use this bracket notation really similar to how we declare an array to look up an individual item. So if I do cars bracket 0, I'm saying I want to see the entry in cars at index 0. In other words, what is the first car? So this is why order is really great, because we look things up based on order. So if we were curious about the first car I ever owned, we would know that that's going to live at index 0. If we were curious about the third car I owned, we could look at cars at 2. And in this way, notice that over here in green, the individual items in the array appear. So this is called bracket notation. And the most basic thing we can use this for is looking up. Apart from looking up items, we can use the same notation to either overwrite or add new items. So let's say that I wanted to add a 5th item in here, or sorry, a 6th item at index 5. See, I'm already mixing it up. So if we want to add a 6th item, which will be at index 5, we could go ahead, let's start by just looking and seeing what's in index 5. And we can see our old friend undefined is in index 5 because there's nothing there. So if we want to, if let's say tomorrow I went out and I bought, what do I want to buy tomorrow? How about a Mustang? So if I go out tomorrow and buy a Mustang, I could go ahead and add that in. I will admit this is not my preferred way of adding items because it requires us to know exactly where the next item goes. But we'll see a better way to do it in a little bit, and just know that this is allowed. You can do this. We can also use bracket notation to overwrite something. So this Jetta is the worst car I've ever owned. It was a total lemon. I ended up spending more money on it than I even paid to buy it to fix it up. So let's say that I want to repress this from my memory. I want to say, let's pretend that instead of a Jetta, I had a Mustang. That seems like a better memory. So if I go ahead and assign the string Mustang into cars at 2, it's actually going to overwrite the current entry. So if we now look inside of our array, we can see that the Jetta has been replaced with a Mustang. Much better college memories if I had had a working Mustang instead of a non-working Jetta. Okay, so bracket notation. We can use it to look things up, to overwrite things, and to even add new items. And that's really one of the critical features of arrays. It may seem like a small thing, but it's really useful. It's really useful to be able to play around and change things. And there's one more thing I want to mention in this vein that's also a common point of confusion. So some of you might already be asking yourself this question, which is, why was I allowed to do line 12 if this is constant? We know that when we use the constant keyword to create a variable, that means that it's stuck. We can't overwrite it, but it looks like I overwrote something down here. So why was that allowed? The answer is that we didn't actually change the array. The array as a whole was preserved. We just we tweaked what was inside of it, which is allowed, but we didn't overwrite it. So notice if I did cars and I just replaced this with a totally new list. Let's do Tamara, and we can do a GTI, etc. If I tried to replace this, we would get that familiar error that we've tried to redefine a const thing. But we're still allowed to add items, remove items, overwrite items within even a constant array. So I ask my students to think about this as being a house. So by actually creating the array, we have built a house. By populating it, we're just furnishing it. So we're not allowed to demolish the house and build a new one, but we can rearrange the furniture. We can bring furniture in, take it out, even rearrange the order. All of that is allowed. The house is still the house. So we're just changing what's inside it, but we're not changing the structure itself. So that's hopefully addressed a question that some of you guys might have. So that is how arrays work. We can think about the array itself as being constant, but the content inside it, we are allowed to move as we will. And on that note, we're actually allowed to even start with an empty array. We can go ahead and declare a completely empty array by just using the brackets. And then we could start to put values inside of it. So this would not be maybe the most efficient way to do it, but this is allowed too. We can start with something empty and then start to populate it as we go. And we see that those two items have been put inside. So let me bring back that full array real quick. Okay, so let's talk about properties and methods. So we've already discussed a lot of different reasons why we might want to use an array instead of, like I did at the beginning, just listing out every item individually. Another reason is that, like any other data type in JavaScript, there's some fun built-in functionality. So, and just to clarify that point, arrays are a new data type. So we already looked at some of these primitive data types like strings or numbers, et cetera, et cetera. But we're starting to look at some more complex types of data in JavaScript, like functions, which we saw yesterday. And in this case, we're looking at arrays. So, so as with strings, there are actually some cool built-in things that we can do with arrays. So very similar to string, we have a property called length. So the length is 5. So this is another maybe point of confusion, is that even though the last item is at index 4, the length still just refers to how many there are. So if we count on our fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we see that there are 5 items in here. So the length is exactly what you would expect. It's just how many items are in here. And it can be super useful to be able to just know offhand how big this array is. So we can use this property, cars.length, to look up the length. There are also methods. So just like strings, there are some built-in methods to these arrays that can let us do fun things. So I mentioned that this, just explicitly tossing something in, is not the best way, if I can spell Mustang, is not the best way to add a new item into our array. We don't necessarily like doing this because it requires us to know how long this array is. And as we see, we can look it up if we want, but there's an even easier way to do this. It's a method called push. I'll show you pop in a minute. So push allows us to put a new item on our array. So it expects one, as a reminder, it expects one parameter which is a new array item. And in this case, I've put in an argument, which is the string Mustang. So we're going to go ahead and call our push method with the parentheses, and then I'll pass in this argument of Mustang. And down here, when we look inside of push, we see that this has been updated. We see that our Mustang has now been attached on the end. And this is totally regardless of how long our array is. I could go ahead and write several other push statements if I wanted. What else do I want to get? Don't know cars well enough. Let's do a GTI. Okay, so if I can push in multiple things and it doesn't care how long the array is, it'll just stick it on the back. So hopefully I have ingrained in this some good function questions from last night, and you're asking yourself, okay, does push have a return value? So we saw what the parameter for push is, but we always want to ask about return values. So as we know, the best way to check in Replit what the return value is we just call the function and see what pops up. And it turns out that push does have a return value. It will give you the new length of the array. So now we have gone from an array of length 5 to 6. So this method will actually return a 6. In my experience, I don't often use the return value of push. Usually I just use it on its own to push something in, but that return value exists if we ever need it. So there is one useful method. Let's go ahead and play with another one. This one is called pop. So pop has no parameters, so we don't have to put anything in. So we see no parameters, and it will return out the last item in the array. So when I run array.pop, I'm going to get that Mustang that I just pushed in popped back out. And the final effect, as you might have guessed, is the opposite of push. It has actually been popped off of the end. So the pop method removes the very last item. This is a really great tool if you're working with something like a queue. So if you had, for example, a list of people waiting in line in an array, you could use the pop method to figure out, okay, who's the, well, I guess not really a good line if the last person in line gets to go next. But okay, you could think of it like a stack of cards. If you have an array that represents a stack of cards, you could pop off the top item of the card, and that's like lifting up the card. And then you see what the card is, and it's now been removed from the collection. So we can think of pop as popping off the last item, and it will not only return that last item, it will also remove it from the list. So push adds an item to the back, pop removes it. There are some functions built in, some methods built in called shift and unshift, which do the same thing for the first item. I will let you guys look those up and play with them if you're curious. And in general, I will just say, as with everything else we've seen, there's a lot that I'm not teaching you. I have up here the actual list of every single, here is every single array method. There are a lot. We will learn a couple more before the week is over, but we will not be learning all of these by any means. So if you're curious, I would look up the documentation and you could maybe play with some of these other array methods. But for starters, I would just practice getting comfortable with push and pop and with the syntax of arrays in general. Okay, so and another question that gets asked a lot is, can you push or pop something from the middle of the array? So we had this idea of, I mentioned earlier, the Jetta, not my favorite car. So if I wanted to get rid of it, I could always overwrite it with undefined. And then if I look inside, we see that there's just sort of this missing data here. Or I could put null. Maybe I want to put in a null to represent a period that I didn't have a car. So we could always overwrite it with something like null or undefined. But notice that it's still floating. We haven't actually removed this item. So you can remove an item from the middle of an array, but there's no specific method that does it. It'll take, it's not too hard, but it'll take a little finagling. So, so anyways, just so you know, there isn't a super easy built-in way to just remove or add something in the middle, but you can do it with a little bit of tweaking. So there you go. That's arrays for you. There's one more thing I want to show you with arrays, and then we will move on to objects. And this is to tie in looping. So it turns out that loops and arrays go hand in hand. So let's say we wanted to log all of the cars I have ever owned. Pretty easy with a loop. So when we're looping through an array, we always start at 0. It makes sense because our arrays by default start at 0. So we let I equal 0. We set it less than cars.length. So you'll always do I is less than the name of your array dot length. Because of 0 indexing, this is a less than, not a less than equals to. And then finally, we just want to increment our I. So in this way, I can easily loop through my array, and I could console log cars at I. So notice that instead of explicitly saying which number I want to look up, I can actually take this variable I, which will be set equal to a different number every time, and pass this into the brackets. And because this I will resolve to a number, the lookup will work just fine. So in this way, I can log all my items in an array. So this is really great. It's arrays and for loops really work quite well together. I will say that, as I briefly mentioned that last week, there is something called a for each loop, which works even better with arrays. It's my preferred way of looping through arrays. And you will learn all about that on Thursday. So something to look forward to for later in the week. But for now, just a little example of how we can use for loops to log all the items in our array, or potentially play with the items in our array in some way. And we see that we can not only pass in numbers into our index, but we can actually pass in a variable that is equal to a number into our brackets. And that will allow us to look up on our array just like we would with a regular number. So that is my last little piece about arrays. Now let's move on to objects. So another question that I'm commonly asked about arrays is, can we put different types of data in? So we saw in the example, the main example I did was all strings. We also saw that briefly I did a number example where I put in all numbers into my array. But what if you wanted to mix and match? So let me show you an example of that. Let's say that I wanted to create a profile for myself. So I'm going to create an array called my info, and I want to put in my name. Maybe I want to put in my social security number. This is not really my social security number, by the way. Maybe I put in my hometown and put in my current town. And then let's say that I also want to put in a value for if I know JavaScript or not, which of course is going to be true. So here we go. I've created this array for myself that contains a bunch of different types. There are 3 strings in here. There is a number, there is a Boolean value, and from a syntax perspective, from JavaScript's perspective, that's totally allowed. So if I look up my info and run this code, we see it pops up, all is good to go. But you might have noticed a little problem with this. So as I'm speaking out loud while typing this, it's pretty clear what this contains because I said this is my name, that's my social, this is my hometown, et cetera, et cetera. But imagine if I weren't talking. Imagine if you as a developer just saw this array without any explanation. Well, we could probably guess that this is a name. We'd probably have no idea what that is. We can see that these are both locations, but we're not really sure what they refer to. And we have absolutely no idea what the true that refers to. That could really mean anything. This could be if I love cats or not. This could be the number of cats I own because I love cats so much. So this is not a very good array. It's not very informative. And we could remedy that by adding a comment in here, explaining the array, but there's a better way to do it. This is an example where we would want to use an object. Okay, so an object is a different data structure, and it's for a unordered collection with labeling. So objects we kind of lose this ability to order things when we use objects, but we gain an ability to label, which as we can see, would solve our confusion issue pretty well here. So, and I will say one more note about this idea of adding mixed types in arrays. Be careful doing that, because my experience is that a lot of the times if you're throwing a bunch of different types of things inside of an array, it's a scenario where labeling might be useful. And in that case, you might do better to have an object. So this is our what not to do example. Let's do something better now. Okay, so I'm going to create all this info inside of an object. Actually, let me copy it over. 1 second. Okay, so there we have it, an object. So from a syntax perspective, not too different than an array, but there are some differences. So let's break this down in detail. As always, we just start with declaring our variable and naming it. Notice that for objects, we don't usually use plural nouns like we do with arrays. So something like my info would be already QS that maybe this is a more appropriate object than it is an array. And also, as you might have gathered, we are creating a constant object, but that does not mean that we can't change double negative, but we can change individual items in here. So we won't be able to overwrite this with a new object or something else, but we will have the freedom to tweak what's inside of it at our leisure, which we will see in a minute. Okay, so we start off with our standard declaring variable syntax, and then similar to an array, we use brackets to denote that we are doing an object, but we now use curly brackets. If I were to change these to non-curly brackets, to these hard brackets, I would get an error because we don't have proper array syntax in here. So we have to use the right type of bracket or else we're going to be in trouble. So curly brackets for objects. Array is these guys, objects are these guys. So then we do these key value pairs. So instead of just doing individual entries like we did with arrays, we do pairs. So we start off with what's called our property name or a key. And so this is, we could kind of think about these as being like strings. They're going to be text-based, but we don't actually have to put them in quotes. We can, you won't have a problem if you put them in quotes, but you don't have to. So name is going to be my first label. I follow it by a colon, and then I put the value that I want to store into name. And then the next one, I do my new property name is social security number, followed by the actual number, et cetera, et cetera. Everything is separated by commas. Notice that I put a comma at the end of the last entry. That is optional. It'll work with it. It'll work without it. I like to put this there because then if you want to add another key and value here, you can just type it in. It's really easy to forget to add a comma. So that's your choice. I would recommend the final comma on these things. So there you go. That's our first object. And if we look inside of my info, we can see that my info actually represents the entire collection. So just like the name of our array represented the entire collection, the same thing is true with our object. So let's get rid of this array example because we know that it's not what we want, and we can just focus on our objects. Okay, so my info gives us access to the entire thing. And notice that as with the brackets in arrays, Replit will actually print out the curly bracket to let us know that it is an object that we are working with. So let's say that we want to access an individual item. You might be thinking, okay, it's just like an array. If we want the first key value pair, we look at index 0. This, however, is where arrays and objects start to differ. So these are a little bit different. If we, instead of looking things up by an index, we actually look things up based on the key. So this is why I say that arrays are ordered, but objects are unordered. Because even though literally we have to write things in order, there's nothing that really built into the structure that says that this is the first key value pair. They're all just kind of floating out there amorphously. So instead of looking up these properties by index, because indices don't really exist on objects, we look them up using the dot notation. So this is the same notation we use for built-in properties like length, but in this case, we're using it to look up property that we ourselves wrote. So if I do info.name or info.nose.js, etc., I can actually look up any of the values here based on the key name. So just like with arrays, we can also use this to do some other fun things like overwriting. So let's say that I, heaven forbid, fall down a giant staircase tonight, have amnesia, and totally forget JavaScript. So in that case, Nose JavaScript would have to change to false. So notice that I can actually use dot notation to overwrite a key. So then I can look up what's inside of here. And I will see that the value inside of the object has been overwritten. So if instead I wanted to write out the full name of my hometown, I could do the same thing. And then, well, just doing this will return just the value, and then let's look inside the overall object. All right, so if we look inside the overall object, we see that, sorry guys, we're having a little bit of a spamming issue in the chat. Would appreciate if you guys would stop that. I think it's distracting to everyone. Just wanted to make a note about that. And then let's go back to our object. Okay, so I've gone ahead and used dot notation and the same syntax we use to put values into variables. And then we can see that Salt Lake has been overwritten with Salt Lake City. So the same idea that this kind of gives us our starting place with the objects, but we can go ahead and edit things down here as we see fit using dot notation. We can also use dot notation to add a totally new property. So if I want to put in a new Boolean called hates it when people spam the chat, I would set that to true. A little bit of a long property name, but when we look inside of it, we can see that it has now appeared inside of this object. So we can use dot notation to look up, to overwrite, or to add new properties into our object. There's another cool thing we can do with this, which is deleting properties. So if we want to, we could always, let's say that I'm like, I don't want you guys to know where I live. We could override this, of course, with something like undefined or null. And then if we look inside, we see that it's been overwritten, but the property is still on the object. So there's actually a much better way to get rid of this, and that's with the delete keyword. So here's a new keyword for you guys, delete. If we follow that by an object and a property, it will actually fully erase this. So now when we look inside, it's like the current town never existed. So the delete is a nice, useful tool we can use to actually completely remove items from objects. So this is a way that objects are kind of superior to arrays. As I mentioned, popping off the last item in an array is easy, but deleting something in the middle is not so straightforward. In an object, because it's unordered, we can very easily just delete any property in this one simple line using the delete keyword. So dot notation is the way to go when we're looking things up. But there is actually a better or another way to do it that might be useful in some cases. So we always want to use dot notation when we know the name of our property. Sometimes we want to look up when we don't know the name. So how would we not know the name of the property that we're looking up? Well, maybe we're getting a variable that's coming in through a function or coming in from a user or from a different file, and it's just some mysterious variable named key. So I'll actually explicitly write this thing out, but let's say that we know there's a variable called key, but we don't know what it contains. That's totally conceivable. You know, if key were an argument or a parameter on a function or something that we're importing from somewhere else. So we might, in some cases, actually be working with a variable name that contains a key. In that case, we don't explicitly know the name of our property. We have a variable that contains a property name. So when we have a variable that contains a property name, we can't use dot notation. Let me show you why. If I try doing myinfo.key, it's looking for a property actually called key. So if I put key in here, now we could look up the key property, but we're not looking up the thing that's actually stored in the key variable. So we don't want to use dot notation. In this case, we use bracket notation. Bracket notation is used on objects when we actually have a variable that we want to pass in. So when we have a variable name that refers to a property name, we use bracket notation. And in this way, we can actually look up the value of hometown without maybe even knowing which value we're looking up. This is a super useful thing that comes up a lot. And we'll actually see one example where we need to use bracket notation by the end of tonight. All right, so that is, those are kind of the basics of objects. So one thing I want to draw your attention back to is this idea of properties. So far, properties have referred to things that are built into JavaScript, like the length property on arrays or strings. In this case, properties are things that we actually created ourselves. The same is going to be true about methods. Strings and arrays have all these useful built-in methods that we might use. But when it comes to objects, we're going to be the ones building our own methods. So let's go ahead and do this. So I'm going to create a say hi method. So notice that I create this method using the dot notation. I'm really just assigning it like any other property. And just as a terminology clarification, it's just, we would call this a method instead of a property just because it's a function. Now we're seeing a different side of something we're used to working with. We're used to methods being things that we have to call, functions, and now we can see that when we create methods, we're actually going to set them equal to functions. So I've gone ahead and defined a new property name, which is going to be a method called say hi, and I've set it equal to an anonymous function. Remember that this would be called an anonymous function because we haven't put a name right here. So an anonymous function, and this is going to actually say, hello, I am Deandra. So I have added a method onto this object. So if we go ahead and call myinfo.sayhi, we have to, of course, call it with the parentheses. There's no parameters, so we don't have to pass anything in. And notice that this greeting is logged to the console. So, oh, and one other thing I just wanted to mention is that you can create methods inside of the object if you want. So if we wanted to create this inside of our object like this, we would just, let me format this. We would just define the method name, use the colon, and then put our anonymous function directly in. I'm going to keep it out for now just because I think this gets a little cluttered and it's maybe a little overwhelming when you're first seeing objects, but just know that this is allowed and this is totally valid. So down here, I have my say hi function. So you might have noticed though that there's something kind of off with my say hi function. What happens if I change my info.name to Bertrand? So I've changed the name, but notice that the greeting, the say hi function, still logs out Deandra. We don't want that because Deandra is no longer the name on here. So what we can do instead is actually pass the name value itself into the console log. So what I'm doing is I'm actually saying log hello I am and then log out the name property. So notice that it now live updates. So if this thing is set to Deandra, it logs Deandra. If it's set to Bertrand, it logs Bertrand. If I actually deleted this property, this name property, it would say hello I am undefined, which is less useful, but it would still, the point being that it's actually live updates. There's one more way to accomplish the same thing, and I want to introduce you to a new keyword called this. So instead of saying my info, we could use the keyword this, and it will refer to my info. So it's going to accomplish the same thing. So you might be wondering, why would we bother with the this keyword if this is more readable and works the same? The answer is that in this case, this keyword is not required, but tomorrow we'll be seeing some more examples using this. So I just wanted to get it on your radar. So it's starting to stew in your brain and you're ready to use this in a more meaningful way tomorrow. So just wanted to introduce you to that keyword and reiterate that we have actually, instead of just using a built-in function, created a function or a method. And I remember saying this on Monday night, actually, that I said, well, a method's a built-in function. And then I kind of said, well, it's not necessarily built-in. This is why, because we can actually write our own methods on objects. All right, so the last thing I want to show you is a little bit of object looping. And then I'll go over the homework and open up to questions. I know you guys have been asking lots of great questions in Zoom. I will get to as many of them as I can in just a minute here. So looping through, you might be wondering how we do that, because if we tried doing a loop, well, first of all, we don't know where to start because my info doesn't have a length property unless we wrote one on. And there's also no looking up based on numbers. So I think we can see already that a for loop is not going to cut it. Fortunately, there is a loop designed for objects called a for in loop. So let's go ahead and write this thing out, and then I will go over how this works. Okay, so we use that same for keyword, but notice that our conditions are a little more simple when we're doing a object. So we start with let key. So key is kind of like our I in this case. Key is going to be, this is a variable name we pick. It could be potato if we wanted. That wouldn't be a very good variable name though. So key is something we pick. By default, just do key. Most for in loops just use key. So this will loop through all the keys. And then we say in, and we have to specify our object. So this will loop through all of the keys in my info, and it will log them out. In this case, I'm asking it to log them out. So we can see that all 5 of our keys have been logged. What if we want to actually look up the value? So right now we're just getting our keys. What if we want to also log our value? Well, we have a variable that is set equal to a key name. As we know, that is when we want to use bracket notation. So we have a variable that contains a property name. That means that we can actually do my info bracket key, and it will in turn look up all of the values of each of these keys. So when we run this, key loops through and changes every time, and each time we're going to see that our key is logged, and then using the bracket notation, we can look up our value. So using this for in loop, we can look through all the keys in our objects, we can look through all the values in our objects. Really useful thing to have under our tool belt. So here's just a different for loop, the for in loop that we can use with objects specifically. So that is all I have for you guys for arrays and objects. As a little reminder, objects are the super useful data structure that we want to use when we have data that needs to be labeled. So usually the object data is a little more chaotic. They're of course all related, but they kind of refer to different types of things. So we have to go in and actually label them so that this data is clear. And it does not preserve order, so it's not a good thing when we want to actually order items. For ordered items, we use an array. Arrays are great when we have a collection of ordered or unordered items that don't require any sort of labeling, like that cars example I showed you. They're a little different as well in that with arrays, we can use a bunch of awesome built-in methods. With objects, instead, we can write our own methods or define our own properties. In both cases, we can do lookups, we can overwrite, we can delete, and we can loop through them. So those are arrays and objects for you guys. In the homework tonight, it's going to look pretty similar to last night in that it's just one assignment. And you have a bunch of these empty functions, and it's your job to write the function in line with the specifications that we put up here. The difference between this and last night is that all of these functions have to do with arrays or objects in some ways. In some cases, you'll be receiving an array as your input. In some cases, you'll be having to build one yourself. So that is the homework for tonight. All right, so let's go ahead and switch my focus to questions. I see a few outstanding questions here. Let me scroll through. Okay. So we had a question about, do arrays work with var and let? So yes, any type of data in JavaScript could be declared using var or let. As mentioned, we wouldn't want to use var because it is an outdated way to declare variables, so we want to stay away from it. To be honest, there probably is some case where we might want to use let for an object or array, but in most cases, we really want to be sticking with const. Because as I said, we have the freedom, even with const, to manipulate the individual pieces inside of this. But let means that for some reason, we might want to actually overwrite my info. So maybe if there's some example where we might be planning on committing some crimes and running away from the country, and we want to totally redefine who we are. And I can, in this case, become Bertrand at long last and come up with a new social for myself. In this, et cetera, where should Bertrand be from? Let's say he's from Bali. And of course, he's seeking asylum in Bolivia. Bolivia is not, these are not towns, these are countries. Wait, is Bali? Yeah, Bali's a country. I'm embarrassing myself. I'm going to stop talking. Okay, so anyways, the point being that in this case, we would want to use let because we're totally overwriting what's inside of it. But most of the time we wouldn't do that. We just overwrite individual values, in which case const is the way to go. Okay, here is an interesting question. So there is a global object, which you may or may not know about, called, let me get rid of some of this stuff, 1 second. There is a global object that exists called object, and an object that exists called array. And so we had a question about what's the difference between this global object called object versus this individual object. And I will say that tomorrow's lesson is pretty much all about this distinction. So you will get a super thorough answer tomorrow. But just to get the wheels turning on this, I will answer it right now, which is that you can think about this object, this object as being the rule book for how we build objects. So all the hidden behind the scenes functionality in objects lives inside of here. Whereas this is a specific instance of an object. This is one individual object we've made. Same thing here. This thing called array with a capital A tells us how to build arrays. It's where all the hidden functionality lives. Whereas if I created an array right here, this is just one specific instance of an array. So if that doesn't totally make sense right now, that's totally fine. We will be spending pretty much all of tomorrow night exploring this concept. So good question, really insightful to ask that, and a little preview of what's to come. Okay, we have a question about, a kind of long question about traversing arrays. So we have kind of a long question about traversing arrays. I'm not going to fully answer this, but it touches on one point that I want to get at. So I'm going to at least address part of it, which is this idea of, I guess we can go over this in terms of looping. So let's create a numbers array. I'll make it real simple and just have it contain the numbers 0 through 5. So of course, if we want to loop through this, numbers.length, we would of course do numbers at I. So we're starting at, and just to think about this, we're starting at 0 and looping through the index. And so notice that this gives us everything in this numbers array. But let's say that we wanted to go backwards, to start with the last item and go in. So our starting point, you might think, is numbers.length. Let me get rid of this condition for a second. So you might think, okay, we want to start at the last item, so we need to start at numbers.length. However, that's not quite right because of zero indexing. So the last item in the array always has the index of length minus 1. So there's always this offset. So if we wanted to go backwards, we would start our index at the length minus 1. And then we would want to go all the way down to 0. So as long as I is greater than or equal to 0. And then, of course, we would do I minus minus. So in this case, what did I do wrong? As long as I is greater than or equal to 0. So now we start at, because there's 6 items, we start at 5, length minus 1, and we just decrease until we hit 0. So the biggest takeaway here is common mistake of thinking that the last item is going to be at numbers.length. Numbers.length would refer to the index of the first blank spot in the array. Numbers.length minus 1 will give you the index of the last item in the array. We had kind of a format question about, is there a way to rewind this video? I don't believe there is a way to do that in Zoom, but it is going on YouTube. So you can look that up on YouTube. I can post that link in Slack if you guys want. And using YouTube, you'll be able to scroll through and rewatch old parts and see that part where I forgot that Bolivia is a country instead of a town. I don't know why I brought that up again. Okay, so question about the homework, which is, if I'm understanding this question correctly, so in each problem, we of course have instructions and a comment, but then we also start to write the function. What we do is we name the function and then we pass in we suggest a parameter name. And so I think the question is, should we leave this alone? So if you were to change the name of this function, if you decide that this should be called something else, then you will be in trouble. The tests are going to use the name of the function. So make sure you are not changing this. If you really wanted to change the name of the parameter, you could, and you wouldn't have a problem. But we've named them in a way that will probably help you answer. So the short answer here is, do not change or edit the code that we've provided for you. It's there for a reason. You can, of course, write anything you want inside of it, but don't be editing this piece, because worst case scenario, you break our tests and you don't know if your code is working or not. Best case scenario, you just maybe make your life a little more confusing than you need to. All right, any other questions out there? I am not seeing anything else, so I will let you guys go, and you can go ahead and start working on the homework. All right, so that is it for tonight's lecture. First time on Zoom. If you guys have any feedback about how Zoom is working, I'm glad to hear it. So put that in Slack or message that to me. It might take me a few lessons to figure out how to use all the fancy tricks inside of Zoom to best facilitate this class, but I hope everything went well. I honestly really like this because I have more of a direct line between you guys, and I don't have to wait for like the 20-second delay from when you type or from when I stream to when you actually see it and then ask in Slack. So that's it for tonight. We learned all about arrays and objects, another couple of really useful things that you can use in JavaScript. Good luck with the homework tonight, and tomorrow we will be learning all about classes. Classes are one of my favorite topics. So I'm really excited for tomorrow's lecture, and I will see you guys there. Have a great night.
That I think is pretty cool and will make you think a little bit more about when is a dictionary right versus when is an array the right thing to use, and so on. Okay, any very last minute questions? Oh, there are 2 in the Q&A panel that I missed. Why do questions not appear here in real time? I honestly have no idea. It's the first time I've ever used Zoom for this stuff. So I wish I knew. I see all the questions I think that get asked. I don't know if they're visible to everyone else or not. And I dismiss them after I've answered them. So like I'm going to dismiss yours right now. Not because it wasn't a good question. I just don't really know the answer. Can you have an array with multiple dictionaries? Yes, you could have an array of dictionaries. Absolutely. There's no reason you couldn't do that. And in fact, that's quite a common thing to have an array with dictionaries in it. Absolutely. And in fact, you'll do the opposite in your homework tonight. You'll have a dictionary with arrays in it, but you can also have an array with dictionaries in it. Okay. Any last minute questions before we wrap up? Serena, I remember yours. Ronald says he missed the link. I don't know which link you're asking about. Perhaps the link to, you were the one that I think meant to be in the web course. Maybe somebody else post that link. I don't know. I said that I couldn't get it because I just couldn't get it quickly and I'm in the middle of teaching. So maybe ask on Slack after we finish here, or send me a message. Send me an email if you want, andrew@lambdaschool.com. Shouldn't a friends by location dictionary have locations as keys? Naming question. That is a great question. And the question, the way to answer that is, do I want to find where a friend lives given the friend's name? Or do I want to find the friend that lives somewhere given the location's name? You want whatever you're going to use to look up the other information should be your key. So in this case, if somebody asks me, hey, where does your friend Andrew live? I know Andrew's name. I don't remember where he lives. I want to ask the dictionary, where does Andrew live? What is the value for the key Andrew? On the other hand, if I had used the locations for keys and somebody said, where does Andrew live? I can't ask there is no way to, well, there is. You could write a for loop that went through all of the keys, check to see what each of their values was and found it, but that's slow again and a lot of code. If we did that, we would have to say, we would be asking the dictionary, hey, who's the person for Vermont? Is it Andrew? Yeah, okay, I found them. Is it James? No, okay, I got to keep going. And that's bad code. So use the key as the thing that you will have, and the value is the information you will want to look up. Yes, you can do reverse lookup, but not directly. You have to write a for loop that goes through all of the pairs in the dictionary and finds the one you're looking for. There are good technical reasons for that, but that's a discussion for another day. But the dictionary in Swift doesn't let you do direct reverse lookup like that. That's a great question though. You could think that you could come up with a data structure that where keys and values are identically, have identical semantics. So if you given one, you can find the other and vice versa, but that's not how dictionaries in Swift work. All right, last but not least, Serena, you wanted to know how to do the count of string in array. I forgot my one-liner. We showed how to do this with a for loop, but you can also do it in one line by going return array dot filter $0 equals string dot count. Oh, can't see my screen. Yes, I seem to do that all the time. Okay, now you should be able to see it. So it's this right here. Return array dot filter, and then in braces, these are called braces, curly braces, $0 equals string, and then dot count. And again, as I said before, I do not expect any of you to look at this and understand it because we haven't covered any of this stuff yet, and that's completely fine. The point is just to show you that you can solve problems in multiple ways, and sometimes if you're clever, you can solve them with a really small amount of code compared to sort of the obvious solution. So that can be cool. But you also shouldn't, as a new programmer, you can be you get excited about learning something like this, and you think, oh, I'm going to be as clever as possible and make this as short as possible. But in doing so, you might make the code less easy to understand for somebody else, and that's often a bad thing. So strive to write code that's clear more than code that's clever. All right, so that wraps up everything. I'm going to sign off. Please work on your project, get help from your PMs, and join in the third hour discussion groups. And I appreciate all of you being here so much. Oh, and last but not least, a reminder that if you have questions about applying for the full-time course, feel free to ask. That's everything. Thanks, guys. Yes, on Slack. Everything here, we're gonna go back to Slack for PM groups for now. We may work out something different for that later. Oh, actually, you know what? We were talking about splitting you up in Zoom, but I'm not sure how to do that. Stay here for just a minute. Let me see if I can figure that out. Give me just a sec. I might be able to figure this out. PMs might know better than me. If a PM is in here, I'm trying to see who's in here. Boomer, do you know how to split people into groups?